received from our insurance actuarialist is a projected 10% increase in insurance rates. We budgeted 7%, and then I went back to them recently when we got the $300,000 cut from the board and talked to them about where they thought rates were going to come in. And they said that claims have been running good, so that we now only are budgeting a 4% increase in our budget for health insurance. To actually give you a dollar value is not that simple, because we have 5 different plans we offer, and depending on which bargaining unit you're in, and whether you're grandfathered or not grandfathered, and if you're over a certain number of hours or under a certain number of hours, the copay by the employer or an employee and which options are available to you are all different. So we have about 28 different options that people can choose as we go through this process. So it's quite a complex matrix. I have it, and I can certainly share it with somebody, but it's not something that we can get into the nuts and bolts of tonight, because it'll take us an hour to discuss it.
Further comments or questions on Article 3? No? All right, I'm going to close consideration of Article 3, and we'll move on to Article 4. Shall the Ackworth voters vote to appropriate $27,000 to replace the failing leach field at the Ackworth Center School, with said funds to come from the Ackworth Capital Reserve Fund? Can I await a motion? Yes, Linda Christie made the motion. Is there a second? Mary Henry is the second. It's my understanding that this article would only apply to the voters and the taxpayers of Ackworth, so votes on this article from other towns will not be counted. Is that correct? Okay, so you Ackworth voters, if anybody has any questions or comments on this, please raise your card. No? Then I will close consideration of Article 4, and we'll move on to Article 5. Shall the Alstead voters vote to appropriate $47,045 to replace lockers, abate asbestos, restore ceiling after asbestos abatement, and repair stairwells at the Vilas Middle School, and install new flooring at the Alstead Primary School front entry, with said funds to come from the Alstead Capital Reserve Fund? And again, this would only apply to Alstead voters and taxpayers. Any questions or comments? Oh, I guess I need a motion first. Mr. Hogan has made the motion. Linda Christie has made the second. Any questions? No? No questions or comments on Article 5? If not, I'm going to close consideration of Article 5, and we'll move on to Article 6. Shall the Charlestown voters vote to approve $34,900 to install epoxy flooring in the Charlestown Middle School bathrooms, encapsulate the asbestos flooring in the multipurpose room and hallways with an epoxy floor, and replace the failed grease trap at the Charlestown Primary School, with said funds to come from the Charlestown Capital Reserve Fund?
So moved.
John Streeter, who was the second? Bill DeCoste was the second. Again, this is a town-specific article, so it will only affect Charlestown voters and Charlestown taxpayers. Albert St. Pierre.
Probably just a comment. I just wonder why we put asbestos and grease traps and stuff we all know we can't live without in a warrant article, when it should be in the budget getting fixed, and put regular stuff that we could vote down in these articles. You're setting it up, and someday it's going to come back to haunt you.
Anybody want to comment on that? I think the reason that this appears as a special warrant article is that it calls for taking the funds from the capital reserve fund as opposed to just the regular budget. And it would be the capital reserve fund that was designated for improvements in the Charlestown schools. And I believe that's the reason it has to be a special warrant article as opposed to just included in the budget.
I understand that, Mr. Moderator. It's just a list of things that are put in there, that if we asked for the list of everything that needed fixing in Charlestown, there'd be some mundane stuff in that list.
John Streeter? I'll pick you in.
I can appreciate where you're coming from for that. For me, as we look at these issues, I would rather see us put into these warrant articles the items, especially if they're big ticket items, that will be a one-time expense. In a lot of ways, I feel like it's more open, honest, transparent, if you will. That we've said these are the big ticket items that we need, we put them in this budget. I would be more concerned if we put these big ticket items in the budget, and then, hope we remember to take them out next year. I think that's where sometimes budgets get overinflated. So, for my money, I think it's better that we do it this way, but I certainly appreciate where you're coming from.
Andy Collins?
Another perspective, Albert, is if we put all these things in the regular budget, and then the school board directs the administration to cut $300,000, historically, the first place they cut is buildings and grounds and facilities. And this is our way to try to keep our buildings in tip-top shape and properly maintained. And ultimately, it's your choice as a whole.
Other questions or comments on Article 6? No? Seeing none, I'm going to close consideration of Article 6 and we'll move on to Article 7. Shall the Walpole voters vote to appropriate $25,050 to install a fence at the back of the playground and patch paving at Walpole Primary School and install epoxy floors in bathrooms, replace lockers, replace sinks and faucets, replace classroom doors, and replace bathroom partitions at Walpole Elementary School, with said funds to come from the Walpole Capital Reserve Fund. And the school board voted 7 yes and 0 no to recommend this article. Second. Okay. Questions or comments on Article 7? This is a town-specific article that has to do with Walpole. No? Nobody? Okay. So I'm going to close consideration of Article 7 and we'll move on to Article 8. Shall the district vote to appropriate $220,620 to replace the roof on the Early Learning Center and replace exterior doors in the science and weight rooms, install shades in the gym, abate asbestos, replace carpet after the asbestos is abated, and replace the existing oil boiler with a new energy-efficient boiler and replumb the boiler room as needed, all at the high school, with said funds to come from the high school capital reserve fund. And again, the school board recommends this article by a vote of 7 yes and 0 no. Motion? So moved. John Streeter. Roll the cost. Beat you at the punch. So this applies to the high school, so this is going to impact all voters, all taxpayers throughout the district. Questions or comments? Right here.
Chris Reitman, Town of Alstead. Is there somewhere in this that I'm not seeing right off the bat that shows the balances of capital reserve funds?
Underneath each warrant article, there's a little piece of information on it. Warrant article number 8, the high school, on November 30th, the high school capital reserve fund had $481,535,000.
Other questions on Article 8? Questions or comments? Again, this money comes from existing capital reserve funds, so it will not impact taxes, if I'm correct. Ms. Fontaine?
Maybe this is picky, but, how old are these items that are being replaced? Is it just on the schedule, or is there something wrong with these items? I mean, obviously, it sounds like the boiler needs to be done, but just a little more detail about what is being replaced would be nice.
Bill, I'll try to answer, but correct me when I misspeak, will you, please? Bill is our facilities director. The roof on the Early Learning Center is an asphalt shingle roof. It has exceeded its useful life and needs to be replaced before we have leaking issues. And so that is one item. The exterior doors that we're replacing are the last two doors, I believe, that are original to this building. So they were put in this building in 1966. They're steel doors, the bottom's flapping the breeze. It's time to replace them because they've exceeded their useful life. The shades in the gym are a lighting issue that we need to address. The asbestos tile has a 25 to 50 year life. It's very durable, but when it starts to fail, you need to remove it because when it becomes friable, that's when it becomes a hazard. And this tile has carpet on top of it, so when we remove the carpet, the tile will come up with it, so we're going to abate it, get it out of the building, and then put a new surface down in those areas. Our boiler is not our original boiler. It's been replaced once, but it's an old boiler. 2 years ago, when we did energy renovations on this building, we replaced one of the two boilers in the building with a propane boiler, and we didn't have enough funds in that project to complete the boiler room with the second boiler, so that's what this does, is it completes that with the second boiler. When we replace them, we have a lot of pipes and pumps that we need to update, because some of them are the original pipes and pumps, and this will tie them in with the new control system and make it better. I believe that covers everything on the building at the moment.
Questions or comments on Article 8? No? No one? Okay, seeing no other questions or comments, I'm going to close consideration of Article 8 and move on to Article 9. Shall the district vote to raise and appropriate up to $500,000 to be placed in the district's capital reserve funds with the breakdown as follows: 3.60% up to $18,000 to be added to the Ackworth Capital Reserve Fund, 7.79% up to $38,950 to be added to the Alston Capital Reserve Fund, 17.92% up to $89,600 to be added to the Charlestown Capital Reserve Fund, 3.36% up to $16,800 to be added to the Langdon Capital Reserve Fund, and 17.33% up to $86,650 to be added to the Walpole Capital Reserve Fund, and 50% for up to $250,000 to be placed in the High School Capital Reserve Fund, with said funds to come solely from any year-end unassigned general fund balance. These funds are to be held by the trustees of trust funds in the respective towns, and no withdrawal shall be made without consent of the voters. The school board again recommends this article by a vote of 7 yes and no to 0 no. Motion? Gabe St. Pierre made the motion and Linda Christie seconded it. Anybody would like to speak to this?
Just real quick, we decided to do it this way this year because the capital reserves in the towns are getting lower again. And just so you know how this reads, these 3.6, 7.79 is the ADM. So we didn't just come up with those numbers. Again, we did this because the reserves are getting lower in the towns again, because we've been using them, and we feel that it's a good thing to put them back there again. I think last year we didn't do that, we just put money into the high school fund. But again, it's savings in the bank for projects like we have tonight on the other warrant articles that become, not part of our tax. So, that's it, simple.
Any questions or comments on Article 9? Yes, over here.
Trina Dearborn, Charlestown.
How are these funds actually raised? It says to raise and appropriate $500,000. Where does that come from?
The funds are not new tax money, but what they are is at the end of the year, if we have money left over that we didn't spend in this year's operating budget, those are the funds. And under New Hampshire law at the moment, the way we operate, we have only one option with that money. If we don't do something like this, we must return it directly to the towns to directly offset your tax rate next year. Okay, so it's not new money we're raising, it's money you've already paid in on your tax bill this year. And so that's where it's coming from.
Yes, Steve D'Alessio from Walpole.
If it's state law that the money should be returned directly to the taxpayers, why aren't we doing it? And the master agreement does call for the money to go back to the taxpayers. It doesn't call for it to go into a capital reserve fund. I do agree that in the long run, it does save the taxpayer money because it's a savings account that gets used appropriately. But the question really remains is, why are we doing something that, one, the master agreement doesn't really spell out? And two, if we're allowed to do it, why aren't we considering it, considering the tax increases that have taken place?
You, the taxpayers and voters of this community, are authorizing us to spend them. If you don't authorize it, then it must go back to you. And there is no choice. So we are following the law. Because just like when you approve a budget or anything else, you're authorizing an appropriation. If you don't approve these, then the money, if there is any, will go back to the taxpayers.
Mr. D'Alessio has a follow-up.
Yes, just to follow up. I don't think the warrant article is clear that the state law gives the voters the option. And that's where I think the article should be amended to be able to clearly state that state law allows the voters to take place and come back as a tax reduction to the voters.
I could certainly check with the Department of Revenue. The wording for this article, outside of how we're distributing the funds into our different capital reserve funds, is mandated and dictated by the Department of Revenue, and they have reviewed and approved this as meeting the law as they see it. So I'm not sure if I could add that statement that you want or not. I could certainly check with the Department of Revenue.
Andy Collins?
Just to talk a little about what Mr. D'Alessio said, when I first got on the board, I was a big proponent of any year-end surplus ought to go right back to the taxpayers. And I was educated that if we did that year in and year out, some years you have surplus, some years you don't, some years it's big, some years it's little. But what it creates in the tax structure is huge ebbs and flows, huge spikes, and then downward trends. And it's really difficult for the taxpayers to come up with, a lot one year and then it gets reduced the next year. It drives you crazy with your mortgages and your escrows. And I've learned the value of capital reserve funds, and without them, we couldn't really maintain our buildings the way we'd like to. But I think this is the way to go.
Anyone else on Article 9? Albert St. Pierre?
Just another point. We talked about this. I heard earlier the budget is always tight. We always seem to have $500,000 left over at the end of the year to put into capital reserves. Most people don't know where to look in a budget. I look on the back page of tonight's budget. Go back the last 2 years, transfer the food services fund. A couple years ago, we transferred to cover a deficit of $265,000. The next year, we covered a deficit of $223,000. So we cover those deficits, and we still have $500,000 to put into this capital reserve fund. I'm wondering how many millions of dollars are floating around in this tight budget.
Albert, if you look on the next line down on that same document, in fiscal year 2016, we only had $104,293 left at the end of the year. That's about 1/3 of 1% of the budget. Last year, at the end of the year, we had $237,000, which is less than 1% of the budget. So there is not a lot of room in this budget. When you're planning a budget 18 months before you're spending it, you're making a lot of assumptions and hoping that the weather is the way you expect it to, that fuel prices don't change, and many, many things. So, $500,000 is a lot of money, but it's less than 2% of your total budget.
I also understand percentages, and most people in this room understand real dollars when their tax bill comes. It's not a percentage, it's real money. And I also understand going down and working at the food shelf and seeing those folks. I can afford my taxes, but at some point, someone like me who's willing to stand up and speak in public has got the question for those people that can't speak for themselves or won't speak for themselves. We have a lot of people in this district. I know them, I see them, I try to help them. But this is real money, and if they don't care about half of 1% or whatever, 500,000, 750,000, when the town of Charlestown is going, we borrowed 4 times this year to make our payment to the school district of $750,000 each time, because it's not coming in taxes. Houses are being sold to pay those taxes. That's the reality. So percentages don't matter to those people that are losing their houses. And we're going to see with this increase, last year's increase, more of those happening. We'll come back, still wait to be seen. And I will follow this for 2 or 3 years and come back and tell you what happened, because it's going to happen this time.
Other questions or comments? Mary Henry?
Okay, I'm gonna open my mouth and insert, foot here, but educating our children is one of the most important things we can do. The most important, because without them, again, I'm gonna say this and I say it every year, I understand taxes are high, I get that, mine are high. But I know in the end that I wanna see these kids educated and educated well, because they're gonna come back to this community, we hope, and bring their experiences, what they have. I mean, my son came back and is now working in this area as an engineer. But you know what? If he didn't have the education here at Fall Mountain, he wouldn't have gotten that engineering degree. We have a great system here. And I know money is tight, and I know you talk about the budget, and you say we have all this money. We don't have this money. I would love to have this money somewhere. It would be phenomenal, because our kids would have so much more. But we don't. And for me, like I said, educating our children is the first priority. I never thought I'd ever say that in all my years. When I attended this school, education was not the first thing on my mind. My social life was. But you know what? Now it is, because I look at my kids and I look at how far they've come and where they're going, and it's because of the education they got to begin with. And you know what? In business, it takes money to make money. And if we want to get people to come to this school and continue to want to be here, like those 30 kids from Leominster, We have to have an education that is a good education, not just a okay education. A good education, because that's how we're going to attract people to move back into this area. That's how we're going to get them here, and that's how we're going to get the businesses here. But you know what? We also have to go to the state, and we have to push them too. There's power in numbers. It isn't just your school board here. We're getting stuff pushed back on us. Go to your state legislators, call them, email them. All the stuff's out there on the web. Don't just look to us. Look to them. Look to the federal government. Fund education. That's what makes this country great. And that's the only thing that's going to make it great, is educating those kids. Thank you.
Yes, in the middle again.
Bernadilius Ackworth. I am a mechanical engineer, a Fall Mountain graduate, a Charlestown graduate. I grew up here. I now live in Ackworth. I understand what you're saying about your son coming back here, but I can tell you I became an engineer and I also have a degree in geology. I went to school with Craig Elliott at King State. Well, he's a great teacher. Yes, Fall Mountain District does have some great teachers and it has some not so great. I can tell you that I value education. I value inputting money into education. What I don't value is shades on the gym windows. I went to school here. We didn't have an issue with lighting in the gym. We also didn't have lights on our athletic field. It comes back to the basics. I'm active in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, getting grants, fostering K through 10 to get our kids into the engineering and mathematic fields. But what I see this district doing is not focusing on the basics. They're focusing on state championships and lighting and athletics, but not how to add 2 + 2.
Mr. Spilsbury.
I'm all for saving money for a rainy day. Reserve funds are a great idea. We started to build a few reserve funds in the Charlestown municipal budget a few years ago, and they've been well supported. But if you look at these numbers, I'm not sure that's the way this is really being operated. $220,000 for the projects at the high school represents virtually